called Abraham. And Roger's going to come and read to us, because Abraham was someone who was called by God into a life of obedience. And he's the founder of our faith. He's the founder of our Christian faith, Abraham, because he was an obedient person that acted by faith. So Roger's going to come and read, and then Ruth is going to come and explore what it means to lead a life of obedience. Thanks, Roger.
The lesson is taken from the book of Genesis, chapter 12, reading verses 1 to 5. This can be found on page 13 of the Bible, the Church Bible. The call of Abraham. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abraham left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out for Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Just doing removal, sorry. Oh. Well, I've stayed at the same height. I was going to go down there, but I thought that would set the camera off. Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you this morning, and we are continuing our series on journeys. And we're looking at Abraham, journey of obedience, and I've added faith. Without faith, you wouldn't have obedience, and vice versa. I don't know about you, but I like to know where I'm going. I like to have a plan, and if Graham and I go for a hill walk, I like to have a map. Now, Graham will tell you that I have no sense of direction. I have no idea. I'm fine with a map. But don't put me in the middle of nowhere and ask me to get home in a hurry, because you'd have a problem, or I would have a problem. So carrying and reading a map gives me a certain amount of reassurance and security that even if I get lost, I might be able to find the way back, providing, of course, I know which way is north, which can also be a little bit of an issue. And now we have Google Maps, don't we? Which should show us exactly where we are and exactly how we can get from A to B. And we can either go by bus or public transport, or we can look at the train, or we can look at walking. The only problem is, as many of us know, when you're in the middle of nowhere, signal. If you don't get signal, you've had it. So I like a map. Many years ago, I went on a geography school trip to Switzerland, and it was very exciting for me because I had never been abroad, and I had never been on a school residential trip, and I was about 15. And I remember the first night in Interlaken discovering this white puffed up thing folded on my bed and having no idea what this was. Turned out to be a duvet, but I had never ever seen one. One day, we were out walking in the foothills of the Alps, and we found ourselves lost in deep snow. Ironically, we were being led by two geography teachers, as we do. We had no idea where we were. The snow was becoming deeper, and eventually we came across one of these narrow gauge railway lines. You know, the ones that go up the mountains, and yeah, there are trains on them. And our teachers decided that this was the safest way to get us anywhere. So we started walking along the line. The only problem was that we heard coming behind us. So we had to go like a pack of cards either side into the snow. And you can imagine what the train driver said when he stopped after he'd seen us and came back and talked to our teachers. Fortunately, they didn't understand a lot of it either, but it was not a good idea either. And how did we feel? We felt insecure, a bit fearful, and very lost. And maybe that's why, to this day, I like a map. Abraham embarked on a journey of obedience, a journey of faith. He didn't know where he was going or what the reception was going to be like when he got there. What was he going to face along the way? Would he even get where he was supposed to be because he didn't know where he was going? Would he be robbed along the way? Would he be attacked? But God has called him to leave his family and his home and travel to a strange country, and he was going to go. Just as an aside, at this time he was called Abram, A-B-R-A-M. But later God changed this through the story of Abraham to Abraham, and that means the father of many nations. And today I'm just going to call him Abraham so we don't get confused, if that's all right. So Abraham was settled where he was. And if we look at this, if you can see, he used to travel, he used to move up and down between Ur and Haran, whatever you like to call it, in Mesopotamia. And all his family were centered in that area. And he was a nomad. So he would move around, but he only moved around there. In a patriarchal country like his, there wasn't any organized welfare. The extended family was their security. It was what they had. So if you were ill, if you were injured, your family would take care of you. If you needed help, the family would be there. And the immediate family was your defense against the world outside. And then God says to Abraham, leave your country, leave your people and your father's household and go to the land I will show you. How hard is that? God told Abraham to let go of the security that had surrounded him all of his life and to trust God to provide every step of the way in the future. Can we just flip back to the previous slide a minute? So God said, don't go up and down between Ur and Haran. Go that way. Go, as we would say, left, as west. And travel there where you've never been. You don't know what's there. It was a huge thing for him. Okay, we can go back, thank you. So God asked Abraham to obey and take a leap of faith into the darkness. A leap which many of those around him probably thought was completely reckless. What are you doing that for? And if Abraham did as God asked and God didn't provide, he was in serious trouble. And the only thing God told him to do was to go, and he would be with him. And Abraham knew that God told him that he would bless him, that he would make him a great nation, but he couldn't see how God was going to do that. It's one thing for God to tell us something. It's quite another to understand how he is going to do it. And I think we've all known that in our lives sometimes. We want to understand. I like to understand the details and know the outcome. We want to make that detailed plan. We know what we're doing. We've got it down. A to Z, I've got it. Sometimes God asks us to step out into the mist and promises we will find ourselves on a rock. But we need to take that step of faith first. So what did Abraham do when God called him to leave the land where he lived and make his way to an unknown destination? Amazingly, he obeyed God without question and without hesitation. What fired his faith? What made him step out in such amazing faith and trust? He had a clear promise from God, which he believed. I will bless you. I will make your name great. And this was the promise that started him out on a march which, with hindsight, was one of the greatest marches of history. And as I mentioned earlier, in time, Abram became Abraham, to be known as the father of nations. Selwyn Hughes once said, when God calls us to do something or to accomplish something special for him, his call isn't always accompanied by a reason, but it is always accompanied by a promise. It is always easy to understand a promise, but not always easy to understand a reason. We don't always know why, but we have God's promises, which, as the Bible said, are yes and amen. We don't understand why. We can hold on to those promises. Everything wasn't straightforward for Abraham. It wasn't all plain sailing to the west or to the left, as I would say. But I suspect he had to stand on God's promises on a daily basis. But he knew his God. He knew his God. He knew God wouldn't leave him or forsake him. He knew God would keep his promises. Do we know our God like that? Do we know a God who will keep his promises? God doesn't often lay a complete roadmap of our lives. In fact, I don't think ever before us. We may know the next step along the way or even the direction we should be moving in, but it's our faith that keeps us going in obedience to him. I've had a few times in my life when I've had to step out in obedience and faith, not knowing what was next. And one I clearly remember was that Graham and I had been in Edinburgh for about 17 years, moved there when I was a student, and we had 3 young boys. And we both felt God was saying, move. What? Out of Scotland? I can't move out of Scotland. I live in Scotland. I'm adopted Scottish, as people would remind you. I've lived there since I was 2, but I am, and Graham was Scottish through and through, and gosh, we were always going to live in Scotland. All our family are there. But it became clearer and clearer to us that this is where we were being led. So Graham applied for 4 jobs. One was Bangor, where we'd all have to learn Welsh, which I wasn't looking forward to. One was Stoke-on-Trent, which sounded a bit industrial. One was Exeter, which I knew was right down the bottom towards the foot. And one was Huntingdon near Cambridge. So when he phoned me one day to say he'd been offered the Huntingdon job, I thought, well, that's it. That's where God wants us. And then I got the map out. And I thought, that's a long way from Scotland. Wow. So we did find it hard at first because it was a culture change. It was a culture change, as well as being hundreds of miles away from our family. Chris and John arrived there with Scottish accents, and I would say within a month or so, they had lost them due to playground survival. We had to find a house, a school, a church, shops, everything. I remember going to the hospital one day because Chris had got this embedded piece of splinter in his finger. And I said to the nurse, he's got a scalp. And she looked at me and went, what? And I thought, I am in a foreign country. He's got a little piece of wood embedded in his finger. So that was the sort of thing we were up against. But despite all this, we knew it was where God wanted us. We made friends we have until this day. We were very involved in church. I was very, very involved in school governing. The boys went to great schools and found a fulfillment in music and sport and found their faith. We knew that if God had led us to this place, he would be with us every step of the way. We were in his purposes. We had many good times, some really challenging times, some very sad times. and we made mistakes, but God was our rock. And around that time, someone gave me a little card, which I have to this day. Very dog-eared, very precious. Faith is stepping out into the mist and finding ourselves on a rock. How would you feel stepping out there? But God says he is our rock. So going back to Abraham, the writer to the Hebrews writes about Abraham's faith in chapter 11, verses 8 to 10. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. The faith of Abraham is a covenant God faith. He was called to believe that God would give him a homeland, even though he was a wandering stranger, a nomad with no fixed place to call home. They lived on God's promise, and in the end, they never came to possess for themselves the land which God promised them. That was down to another generation. But Abraham was working to build a city that was to come. He lived in the world, as someone said, but his heart was set on another country. His treasure was in another currency, and his citizenship in another realm. He realized he was a part of something much bigger than himself, and he stood on that rock of faith. And in Galatians 3, verse 6, we read, "Consider Abraham. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness." Abraham stepped out in obedience and faith. He didn't earn God's love for him. It was always there. But he showed that he was now in covenant with God, and God promised that he would bless all the nations through him. And the story of Abraham's life can be read in Genesis 12 to 22. I suggest you go home and read it sometime this week. It tells of Abraham's journey continuing, of his unswerving obedience to God. At times, though he made mistakes, he was tested, he had joy. It is one of the first mentions of tithing. At one point when he was rescuing Lot, he gave a tenth of everything to Melchizedek the priest. We find out about Abraham's change of name, the miracle of the birth of Isaac to Sarah, his wife, at 90 years old, of Abraham's test of faith and obedience in taking his son to be sacrificed, which didn't happen. Here was a true pilgrim, someone who was going to follow God with obedience, with faith and hope. So go and read it this week. Read his story. And by Abraham's obedience and faith, he became part of God's plan to save the world. He learned to trust God one step at a time. There were failures along the way, but he grew in his faith and his ability to walk in obedience. He didn't arrive at the place of spiritual maturity all at once. However, he matured in his walk with God as he trusted him through one difficult situation after another. His ability to trust God became so amazing that he could trust God even when he didn't understand, even when he was walking through the dark unknown, as in the story of Isaac. And in Hebrews 11, verse 1, we read, "Now faith is the confidence in what we hope for, and the assurance of what we do not see." Similarly to stepping out in the mist, someone called Patrick Overton wrote about faith. "When you walk to the edge of all the light you know, and are about to step off into the darkness of the unknown, Faith is knowing that one of two things will happen. There will be something solid to stand on, or you will be taught how to fly. You will be taught how to fly. Are you going through challenging times today? Is God prompting you to move on to the next step? Let God speak to you. Give your fears to him. It's often fear that stops us from taking the next step. But I don't know about you. I want to stand on the solid ground God puts under my feet. But I would also like to fly. To be taken on eagle's wings to where he wants me to be. Life can be dull and very safe for many of us. We live in this risk-averse culture, don't we? Safety seems to be the highest goal. We know all about risk assessments and are we safe and all of that. So much that we can end up with our highest aspiration being to arrive safely at death. Do we want to say yes to God? Do we want to journey with him wherever, whenever, however? Do we want to be obedient in faith, in the confidence and in the hope of our calling? Saying yes to God's call doesn't mean we have to sell everything we have and move to Africa, though it might. It doesn't necessarily mean leaving our jobs, our studies, our relationship, though it might. But it does mean stepping out of our comfort zones. And by definition, that means we are uncomfortable. But living authentically for God, living by faith and obedience to him, means that although it is comfortable, I believe we will be taught how to fly. Next Sunday, Graham is flying out to Kathmandu and trekking in the Himalayas. Now, if he said, I want to go my own way, I don't need the guide, we would think he was reckless and would not understand why he rejected the highly experienced guide to show him the way. And he may well miss some amazing views, great experiences, and get very lost. Why do we sometimes reject where God is leading us? Why do we think we've got a better way? Why do we want to do our own thing, whatever stage, whatever age we're at? So, where does God want to journey with you? Are you about to start on that journey of becoming a Christian? That's amazing. Talk to us today. Or maybe as a Christian, your current circumstances means you can't make radical change right now. Perhaps God just wants to tweak areas of your life rather than engage in whole-scale transformation. What about this time tomorrow? Does God want you to do something? Whatever your age or stage, there may be areas that you know God has given you a gift, that he wants to use it here or somewhere else. Pray about it. Ask God what he is saying. Talk to someone else and ask them to pray. At the end of my life, I don't want to regret that I played it safe all the way. I missed out on the adventures that he was calling me on in my journey. Do you? Do you want to step out of the mist and fly? Amen.
I just want to